So you have a background in astrophysics, but you're one of the inventors in the workforce planning space. Tell me about that and tell us about Vemo and who you are and what Vemo is.
Yeah. I remember my early days working on this that,
Well, tell me about that journey. So you obviously moved from the kind of the formative versions of workforce planning. I believe now you've got a fully robust product, even including things like predictive analytics and AI. What does that look like and what does that mean for somebody right now?
right now, what we've discovered is that, well, there's so many different drivers of that over the years, of course. So I would have to collapse that down quite a bit. But I think workforce planning is such, it's an interestingly broad area, right?
Yeah.
The-
Well, do
so
you want to
there's,
define it? Like, I didn't want to start there, but like I find there's like 100 different definitions of workforce planning. Do you have one, or do you just try to meet everyone's definition? And I know we already talked about strategic versus operational earlier, but do you like I don't know? Do you have a stake in the ground in this?
I mean, I think that like, I think people are, I feel like there's some people are somewhat perplexed when they use the strategic versus operational terms.
Welcome to Directionally Correct, a people analytics podcast with your host, Cole Napper. Today's guest is Peter Louch, the CEO of Vemo, as a part of our HR Tech Voices series. Hey, Directionally Correct fans. This podcast is dedicated to you to help educate and entertain you on how to effectively do people analytics, workforce planning, talent intelligence, behavioral science, and understand the impacts of AI in the workplace. If you're looking to stay connected to the podcast, make sure to subscribe to Directionally Correct Substack newsletter, where you can read Cole's articles or watch the video of the podcast. You can also see video on Spotify or YouTube, or listen to the podcast on your app of choice. Feel free to check out Cole's new book, People Analytics, and everything else that's going on at colenapper.com. As always, all opinions are our own, and thanks for being a listener. All right, Peter. So you have a background in astrophysics, but you're one of the inventors in the workforce planning space. Tell me about that and tell us about Vemo and who you are and what Vemo is.
Yeah. I remember my early days working on this that, I knew this guy who was over at, I guess I think he was a salesperson at Connexa at the time,
Mm-hmm.
Tim, and he told me like, and I was trying to describe to him like, yeah, trying to create this workforce planning space, and and he's like, wait a minute, hold on, before you talk more, everything you ever say, you have to start off by saying, I have a degree in astrophysics, and I can tell you this isn't rocket science, but whatever.
Yeah, that
So
joke just writes itself.
yeah, just yeah, it writes itself. So, but I think even when I did that, I always had this sort of penchant for sort of automation. So I've been in the workforce for a while. So when I was in the astrophysics department, I worked as a I worked for credit for class credit, whatever, and a graduate class credit, where I was trying to adapt some old Fortran code to C. And the purpose of it was to automate the collection of light curves from pictures of galaxies. Because now you buy a camera and it just does it, right? Like automatically. But back in the day, you used to have to fit a light curve to each set of pixels. So this process would do that, and it would automate it and run a galaxy through. So the idea was like rather than have grad students spend 2 days working on it, it would work in like 30 minutes. So I kind of think it's like the constant thread through is a sort of like this goal towards automation and taking a lot of people do better things with their smart brains, if you
Yeah.
will.
So are
Yeah,
you saying Vemo runs on Fortran? Is that what you're saying?
that's right. Fortran, baby.
Yeah,
Uh, but I still sometimes think, I sometimes see those loops in my nightmares. I mean, dreams.
I bet. Well,
Yeah.
so so you guys formed 20 something years ago. Tell us a little bit about that journey and what Vemo offers.
Yeah. So the journey was we did start 20 years ago. And we started with a lot of initially consulting during the day. And there's this interesting thing around full cycles where I think a lot of people with tech companies are actually almost looking for some of those things again, where it's like, hey, these planes don't fly themselves type of thing. But I had worked originally at monster.com, or the TMP who owned it. I was responsible for a lot of things that were sort of workforce planning esque. Like we'd have IBM as a customer, and they would say, "Hey, we're running a full page ad just because we want to appear to be bigger than everyone else." And it's like, "Hey, what if we plan for our workforce?" And so people were rumbling about that again because for a while people thought like planning was not a thing to do anymore.
Yeah.
So then I ended up working for a consulting firm that ended up being bought by Manpower. Um, and I was responsible for building like a theory of everything, in
Mhm.
terms of, you know, executive recruiting, resourcing, contingent staffing, managed service, and the idea that planning was like this underpinning of deciding like, talent on demand.
Okay.
Is those At that time things kind of grew currency, like it was like you know, uh, talent supply chain. Everyone was banding that about, and things like that. So I did a lot of internal work to build out. I mean, these slides are so great. Like sometimes I want to go back and find them. They were, I had a dedicated PowerPoint person who just was bringing the vision to life. It was the best of times. So, but anyway, so we did all this and we talked to big companies, and then I kind of felt like I felt like I was like the Mercedes hood ornament on on an economy car at that time. Like they'd they'd roll me out and I'd talk about the future of work and all these things like that, and then they'd be like, "All right, yeah, we're gonna go with you, but can we have like a penny off?" Type of thing,
Yeah.
for these big managed service things. And so at that point, then Manpower bought Right Management, and they said this person needs to get to work and build some stuff. Like, what's he doing? This is not a consulting job. I don't understand this. So I started trying to work on something at the time, which was called talent value management, which was working with HR business partners to assist them in the transition from being HR managers to strategic HR business partners.
Hmm.
And so it was very like formative around planning and analytics, around those areas, around how do you use information and data to have better conversations around that. And so as I got into that area, it eventually became clear that there were not really a lot of technologies for that. Like a lot of people were using maybe like business objects for a lot of the reporting at the time. People were cobbling things together. It was taking forever. And so I made that naive jump, which is like, hey, people have all this data. It's easy to get. Let's create a workforce planning tool.
Oh, how naive.
How naive, right?
Wow. Well, tell me about that journey. So you obviously moved from the kind of the formative versions of workforce planning. I believe now you've got a fully robust product, even including things like predictive analytics and AI. What does that look like, and what does that mean for somebody right now?
Right now, what we've discovered is that, well, there's so many different drivers of that over the years, of course. So I would have to collapse that down quite a bit. But I would say um, um, what we found is that there have been these different cycles where this arm wrestling between like strategic workforce planning and
Mm,
operational workforce planning,
yeah.
and then sort of like this wave of org design that's kind of coming in between over this period of time. So you are influenced, unfortunately, a little bit by like the topics du jour, if you will. But there's a group of people who really want a concrete plan, and they're planful organizations, that need that plan. If you're a utility, you need that plan to have your rate case. If you're in aerospace and defense, you need a plan that will allow you to properly staff all your projects and get your bids and things like that. And then there are other organizations who are like, I just want to figure out like what my most critical resources are in that
Hmm.
whole segmentation piece. So what I found was that in the early days, there's a big focus on segmentation
Yeah.
uh, in critical jobs, and I experienced the point where I feel like I started actually to hate it because, as they say, nobody wants to be a cost center.
Yeah.
People we would like lose the thread on being planning because everybody would be so upset. Like I don't have critical strategic roles.
Yeah.
We even have
Look,
key roles.
all the political infighting starts, and then
Yeah,
everything goes to a halt.
yeah. I don't know if you've experienced. I mean,
Yes.
yeah,
Yes, I've
yeah,
experienced this. The little scar tissue.
yeah. Exactly, Scott. So, but now I feel like it's come back into frame
Mhm.
because the beautiful thing about AI is that we can maybe think like agents. Like not only can we try to create agentic AI, but we can also think that anything's possible. And we can start thinking about like, oh, there's gonna be all these different changes that we need to think about. And we need to start thinking about like, oh, well, what is the criticality of a job? Because people are now really willing to look at it and there's some pressure on them. So is this a job that we are pretty comfortable augmenting? Is this a job we are comfortable partially replacing? Is this a job that's really our secret,
Yeah.
special thing that we do as an organization that we actually need to do more of? Are these jobs which are capability based, which we can actually discover new revenue streams based upon this core capability by augmenting it? So it really introduced a whole new realm to it around it. And so from a predictive analytics perspective, I guess, which is your question, which I accidentally dodged.
You don't have
We
to answer
really,
any of my questions, Peter.
yeah.
This is all about you.
But it over a period of time, you really realize that the key to more successful workforce planning is um, faster. If
Faster.
you can get results more quickly, and if you can get to the point where you're answering questions on demand, then that is like the ultimate goal. Not really possible fully, but possibly partly. So I think that we thought about like there needs to be a predictive modeling ecosystem. So basically, your classical AI, machine learning, that automatically builds all those forecasts all the time. And there's a big change management piece around it where you're not doing it to be accurate or tell someone what they should do. It's telling them what they most likely will do in the absence of intervention.
Mm,
And it's a vexing piece because by doing it, you change that future outcome
yeah.
too.
So I'm going to make some assumptions that you've got things like supply side modeling, demand side modeling, gap analysis. You can look to different intervals into the future. You're making kind of, it sounds like prescriptive recommendations for like what to do or what will happen if you do nothing.
Right.
Is that kind of the core essence of like what a Vemo platform does?
That is the core we do at the starting point of what we started. We
Hmm.
call it like the performa, but then we provide the tools for people to figure out what they should do.
Yeah.
So, for example, we're working really hard with our partnership with Lightcast to bring in that external data in to help people say, oh, this is unrealistic. Like, we want to bring that to the point of decision making if possible. Like, I'm crazy to think I can add 10 of these special AI hardware, blah, blah, blahs, right?
Yeah.
So, and that's a hard thing to do because the whole problem, workforce planning and analytics are these sister disciplines because they're trying to do like um, something, they're trying to break down these silos, I think, you
Yeah.
know? Um, and so you're trying to break down the silo where you say, hey, workforce planning, we're just going to provide this gap. And then later on, recruiting will be looking at external market data and making a decision.
Hmm.
You're trying to say, oh, what is this? And I think, and you had an article recently on this in LinkedIn.
Yeah, I thought I tried to be clever with it. It was called "Make External Data Normal in Strategic Workforce Planning" again. So
So with the headline of it, it was like you kind of went for like, hey, you don't even need your internal data. Sorry, guys. But then I think as you filled it in, then you kind of filled in like, okay, there is the internal and external as
oh
you
yeah.
read more. But I think that's like the silo busting area that we're in workforce planning now, which is like, how can we pull these data threads? And then, as you know, organizations have this, especially large organizations, have this perennial taxonomy problem
Hmm.
where they're unwilling to let it go. They go and they say, we're never going to build another job taxonomy internally, but I don't think they fully mean it because everybody has their special terms. So you have to figure out using AI how to automatically link these things so these outcomes can become sort of more immediately obvious to people around it.
You sent me down so many different directions, but I'll just take the last one. Is this where the org design components that you mentioned come in? So, people want to create their own unique snowflake of a workforce instead of just, using some kind of generic taxonomy, and they need to redesign their workforce as a consequence. And that's where Vemo comes into the equation. Or tell me about what are some of what's the trail of breadcrumbs there?
Yeah, I mean, I think it can be. I think workforce planning is such. It's an interestingly broad area, right?
Yeah.
That,
Well, do
so
you want to
there's.
define it? Like, I didn't want to start there, but like I find there's like 100 different definitions of workforce planning. Do you have one, or do you just try to meet everyone's definition? And I know we already talked about strategic versus operational earlier, but do you like I don't know? Do you have a stake in the ground in this?
I mean, I think that like I think people are. I feel like there's some people are somewhat perplexed when they use the strategic versus operational terms
Yeah.
as a way of trying to box things in convenient containers because like in an ideal system you would have an long-term operational planning that achieved not big S but small strategic input because you'd be capturing strategy more on demand.
Yeah.
That'd be like that'd be the ultimate point. But because that's so hard, people make this line in the sand where they say, well, strategic is more about like the bees,
Hmm.
right? Build, buy,
Yeah.
borrow, et cetera, bot. Um, and operational is more about like the headcount. But the real difference of what makes something more strategic is making it more capability based. And you can decide to be capability based by thinking about your org design. That's like one way.
Hmm.
Um, if you're a very people driven structure, but if you're a very work driven structure, you're going to need to make it more about like your jobs, tasks, and skills. So, so I think it's just at the end of the day, workforce planning to me is just basically like knowing what you need, knowing what your supply will be, knowing how to modify
Yeah.
that supply to get there so that you have a gap plan that you can then execute throughout your talent management, processes, if you will. So I think it's like one of those things where I think it's so many definitions because it is actually a simple high level definition around like the demand supply
Yeah.
gap. Um, and it's all the different siloed needs and also the struggle to do there that cause this sort of complication coming in.
Yeah, my definition of it, I think is different, but it's based on that article that you mentioned. Is I showed that Cartesian plane where the x-axis is external data to internal data, and the y-axis is supply to demand, right? And I say the entire Cartesian plane is workforce planning. So you're combining internal supply and demand with external supply and demand, and that's kind of my catch-all definition of workforce planning because I feel like it. There's a talent acquisition version of it. There's a strategy version of it. There's a change management version. There's an org design version, and that's the only one that I found that feels like it's comprehensive to all those things.
Yeah, I think comprehensive is good. And I think that's also that makes sense for you to produce like a comprehensive like sort of map of
Yeah.
this. But then I think then we'll different like a vendor or different people based on their responsibility will sort of like veer one way or another, right?
Oh, sure.
Towards
Well,
what
I'll even bring people analytics into this. People analytics tends to over-index to internal data, and workforce planning sometimes over-indexes to external data. And the reality is, you need both.
right.
You need to bring them together. And I think your platform is totally suited for that type of an environment. I'm curious though, what's new in workforce planning? So obviously we've had this like AI transformation, this AI revolution that's going on right now, and you guys are staying on the cutting edge of that. If you rewound the clock to like 2020 versus now in your product, what has changed?
Yeah, I think okay, so the big things that have changed are okay, how so one big change that's interesting is that when we came up with this predictive modeling ecosystem, I would say in 2020, people kind of wanted just to like to use the predictions as their
Hmm.
platform. And now what we're seeing is the user behavior is to want to build more rapidly, more dynamic scenarios
Yeah.
around it. So it's actually like almost like laying an extra track on it, where it's like, okay, we want that predictive track, but we want to go in and we want to do top down planning where we set the size and the shape of the organization. So we've adapted to provide more tools to kind of think about there being different roles. So we kind of think about like this coexistence. We're
Mhm.
like thinking a lot about this coexistence of um, strategic workforce planning, operational planning, leaders, talent acquisition, all like existing in this sort of same system. So the strategic workforce planning lead would, bless you, would set the size and the shape of the organization. And
Mhm.
maybe they would do that through some sort of optimization
Yeah.
process. They would then, when they're happy with the overall feel, would then release that and then share it with a number of planners who might actually be leaders now, because maybe the leaders can see like this is the vision for the organization. Now you have to see operationally where are you going to have little issues here and there, who then are going to then submit that. And then there's going to be like HR and finance working together in strategy to kind of like review plans and like, are these on targets with these different inputs? And then all those things should reveal into some planning analytics, which are like, this is, our critical segment. These are our top 10 jobs we're going after. These are the competitors who are also going for these jobs. So it kind of brings it to that realm where then they can do sort of the required action planning around it. So I
Yeah.
think that's the big change, is that, and obviously it's impossible to every little part of that, but we're really sort of trying to say like, how do we handle a sort of ecosystem of planners who have these different needs? Um, so that's one thing. Yeah.
Yeah. Why is workforce planning so cyclical? And why is it even, cyclical? What industries are focusing on it at a particular time?
Yeah. I mean, the cyclicality is, I think that's the most difficult question you've asked me so far, because we go out and we say, hey, only 15% of people, like we went to the Gartner Symposium, where we're like, hey, Gartner says 85% of you aren't doing this
Yeah.
very much, right? Um, and
And then all
so
of a sudden everybody will want to adopt it. And then there'll be this massive shortage of talent in the space, which is ironic because you needed good workforce planning to have good workforce planning talent. I know the joke's not lost on anybody there, but you get this shortage, and then all of a sudden, fast forward 3 or 4 years, no one cares about it anymore. And it's like, or it's not that no one cares, it's like it finds a new home in the organization where one team used to own it and another team will own it, and then they take a completely different model to how they're deploying it. And it's always like it's in this perpetual state of like recycling.
yeah. Well, I think one, okay, so I think it's like a multitude of factors, but I think it's because it's something that people actually are doing some form of planning always.
Yeah.
So it's sort of like a myth that it's a myth that 100% of people aren't doing it, but they're
Sure.
just doing it in a very distributed or very centralized way. I think some organizations, there's one of the things that hurts them is because it's one of the more complex HR driven initiatives. When it's HR driven, there's a desire to try to perfect it before rolling it out. And I think you have to kind of like do this, what people, some of our customers say, you have to fail forward.
Yeah.
You have to actually go in and get it out fast, learn from it, and be like, this is an experiential project, right? This is experiential learning in the form of technology too. Um, and then I think that also, because it's not immediately easy, um, it's like one of those things, like we tried that, it didn't work for us, is a little
Yeah.
bit of that realm too. So it's like kind of combination of things. But at the same time, we have a number of customers who have been like at it proactively and part of the business fabric, who've been doing it for 8, 10 years. So once you get into part of the business fabric, like this is how we do business, then
Yep.
it's a thing, right? So I think it can become a thing. And then some people, like I mentioned before, like utilities must do it. It's part of their rate case, for it. So it's like one of those activities where it's important. So it is a bit of a mystery, but um, I think it's like, I know you attend the same events I do, and there's a lot of people like are really going for these sensational ROIs, right? And things
Yeah.
like that for everything, as opposed to like, I'm going to go in and really understand like what it is we're trying to do and like how we do this. So I know I know. What do you think? I
Yeah.
mean, maybe you can finally enlighten me and I can crack the.
I think it follows. I got into the field post 2008, and I feel like in some people's mind when they're talking about your point is well taken. Organizations are doing workforce planning whether they define it as that or not. Like they're making plans, they're executing upon those plans, they're redesigning their workforce, they're looking at what they need to hire for. Even if it's just a basic headcount planning, they're doing it, right. But when they come in and they try to institute a workforce planning methodology, especially strategic workforce planning, usually it's coming off of either a time of the need for layoffs or a time for the need of strategic disruption, which this is why it's so hot right now, in my opinion, is you coming off the heels of a time of layoffs, and AI workforce transformation is disrupting workforces everywhere all at once. And so every organization is looking under every rock for how can we implement workforce planning to help us make these adjustments. I don't know, is that what you see going on?
Yeah, actually, you made me think of something that I thought for a long time, which is there's like the remodel versus prune.
Yeah.
So, like, in essence, if you're really deep in workforce planning, you realize that it's like this prune methodology that you do all the time, doesn't require this sort of vast remodeling. But right now, like in our big workforce remodel, right? And this transformation is the big topic, so hot. So everyone thinks, yeah, this is what we need to do now. And I think the problem with some of those projects is sometimes they're responding to something which already happened like a year ago.
Yeah.
So I know literally we've had some projects that have come in that they quote like this got approved, and then we went through all the argument about who owned it, and then we went out to bid, and then now it's 2 years old. This business event that we never want to repeat, and so sometimes you're like chasing this past problem, whereas as opposed to just like being part of like good organizational hygiene, if you will, or something like that. And I think that's and I think there's a similar crisis happening, not crisis, but some mini crisis happening in analytics, where I've heard about it a little bit, where a lot of organizations sort of think like, yeah, we could do this a different way, or this would be like this, or maybe we don't need it. Or I've heard about some departments cutting back in the area, but then it's like they only miss it when it's gone. And I think it's one of those things where it's like of course we want better data about our people and processes and all that, but then it gets oversimplified because if you're actually really successful you can kind of make it boring sometimes, like that's like in terms of
Yeah.
well process. So there's that tension
I mean,
there.
that's what you're going for. And I've heard many people say this, and I say it quite often, is the number one goal if you're doing workforce planning internally is to embed yourself into the business processes. And I think that's the way of making it boring. But it brings up a good question, which is, who are the teams that are working with Vemo internally? Are you working strictly with workforce planning teams, or like who's purchasing your software? Like what kind of companies are working with you guys?
Yeah, I mean that's a really interesting question where I think um, it it sits in a lot of different places, which I think is interesting.
Yeah.
Like if you sell recruiting, it sits in talent acquisition.
Hmm.
Maybe someone had a so so sometimes it's sitting within under analytics. Sometimes it's sitting as like a joint project between finance and HR in order to make it more effective. Sometimes there's a specific workforce planning lead, but they have like no support whatsoever.
Yeah.
And then they're supposed to be leveraging HR business partners. And sometimes it sits in IT. So it's sitting in a lot of different places as it matures out there. So it's not inherently clear from organization to organization where it is, but it is if it had one most natural home, it's sort of like a offshoot of sort of like strategic HRIS, if there is such a term. There's sort of, I don't know if there is such a
Oxymoron.
it's all right, but there is like sort of that group because it's like, this, like the numbers are hard. Um, and so people want to like, hey, can we just take care of that in the basement someplace? That stuff
Yeah.
around it, and so we can get these really beautiful reports on things like that. So it sits in different places, but in the really successful implementations, the project was always like top of the list for the head of HR, the finance, and even the CEO. And a lot of times the initiative comes from the board. So the board says, we're hearing a lot about AI.
Hmm.
Our workforce is not ready. We need to become either a skills-based organization. They'll probably start saying we need to become a task-based organization soon. They're not saying that quite yet. I don't think boards are. We
I
need
don't think
workforce.
you're ever going to hear people say it just because I don't think task is a way that normal people talk about work. But I think
Yeah,
they're going to, I keep latching on to this term work intelligence, I think is going to be hot because everybody understands intelligence, everybody understands work. And I think that's what they're going to mean when it's like task based work as we go forward.
yeah. So I think it's like the drill for I think the drill for why people do it starts pretty high up, and it ends up going down all these different paths. So I
Hmm.
think that's the emanation of our project is a little bit like that. Like it's sort of that question where the CEO says, "How come we don't know the answer to this question? We should all know this." And then teams everywhere form and rush to create answers and
Yeah.
compete with the answers. And I think that's how things start. And then either an organization has a mechanism for how they do HR. They have like an operating principles and platform for how they do work, and then it becomes really obvious where it sits. Or we hear a lot of times like we're trying to decide who owns this. Like I
Yeah.
heard from one of the top 50 companies, we're arguing right now whether talent acquisition or talent management owns this. You know,
Yeah.
you
You see a lot of that going on.
see a lot of that, and that's a problem, I would say.
Well, when you're making kind of these scenario plans or you're using, AI to help generate, projections of the future, does it have to be perfect, like rounded to the 4 decimal points, or is just acceptable accuracy, or maybe you might even call it directionally correct? I don't know. Is directionally correct acceptable when doing this type of work, thinking about the data itself and the projections you make?
I think I think we can agree that everything is all about being directionally correct.
Oh,
Yes.
look at that. I like it. I like it.
Yeah, but I mean it's really what the so so if we work with a really large company that has 1,000 data scientists,
Hmm.
of course, if they set their mind to it, they might build unique and novel predictions, which might be better, right? And more enhanced and more. They might have additional access to information that we just don't have. Maybe all, but they are supposed to be driving revenue in that company, right? So what we say is like, hey, you don't have to worry about this because this will run automatically and fast, and it'll be directionally correct. And the trick to predictive information is currency and being able to respond more quickly. So if I can give you a perfect prediction that's 2 months old versus I can give you a 90% prediction or a 95%, which is 5 minutes old, I'm going to work on the 5 minute one because the world's changing quickly, right?
Yeah.
And that's the whole part where I think you and I spoke previously about a presentation we both saw from Jeremy at Merck, where he's talking about,
Mhm.
hey, we have to review AI with the lawyers once a month, you
Yeah.
know? So I think it's like that really current information. It's all about it's directionally correct, and it's giving you something to be like, how do we feel? I know it's like that's a weird thing to say in technology, but how do we feel if our organization looks this way? Will we be able to achieve all the goals we're talking about in this meeting, or do we have the workforce to support that? And I think that's like a really important way to look at it. It's actually meant to be something that's just going to be partially discarded. You're going to kind of say like, my organization is like, no one's saying this right now, but pretend like a couple years back, hey, 80% of my workforce is not really, the business is not really changing that dynamically. This is an area that I can kind of predict what will happen next. This 20% is our bets, and
Mhm.
also our previous bets that didn't work out, and where we're kind of going for sales adjacencies or whatever it is around this where we really need to focus on. So I think it's like it's that question of like, hey, will this workforce continue to basically support the goals where we can accept this as the plan and then give it as that direction? And is this an area where we have to throw away the predictions because we're really needing to do something differently? And then the new thing coming in is, oh, but can AI help us actually come up with better predictions? So in the one of the subtle things, um, it's actually something we've done for a while, but I felt like I described it in a bad way. I said, well, hey, at the heart of our system will predict your demand
Mm-hmm.
on your previous headcount. And I was like, people are really frowning a lot when I'm saying that. And I said, but so then I thought, well, I should really describe more that we're predicting that, but we're tying your jobs to a market taxonomy,
Mm-hmm.
and we're using AI, if you let us, to sort of say like what are the fundamental components of that, whether that's tasks or skills, how are those being affected, and therefore how will that trend be affected based upon these external pieces. And that's like super interesting all of a sudden.
Yeah.
Even though it's just a dialing it in, clicking in further into like how to do predictions. And I think that's an interesting part of it where it's like one of the big, you asked that question of 2020 to 25. So I felt like the predictive crested and then people said, well, it's not perfect. So I have to do it anyway. So I'm going to throw it away. But now it's like, oh, wait a minute, we might need this more because of the pace. And if we can kind of tune it a little bit better and make it more sophisticated in that way, then there's something there.
Yeah. Well, just to go back to what you were saying earlier, the Jeremy you're referencing, previous guest of the podcast, Jeremy Shapiro, who's at Merck, so people can go check out that episode when he was on. One of the things that you mentioned a few times that I'm in violent agreement with you on is moving fast is better than being right. Like just moving at the speed of the business. And early on in the podcast, you said something about, not being a cost center. How do the teams that utilize effective workforce planning move from being a cost center to a profit center?
Yeah, that ties into your book too, right? Because you're
A little
talking
bit.
about yeah, we want to be a value added function, and that's the dilemma that it's sort of that. I want to answer this like in a roundabout way
Just say
because
it. Come on.
yeah,
Nobody's listening. It's just me and you.
yeah, well, because you asked about how I got into this, and I was talking about the consulting work I did,
Yeah.
but uh, so you know how Jeffrey Moore wrote that book, Crossing the Chasm,
Yeah.
and then he wrote a follow up book. He wrote Living on the Fault Line.
Okay.
And
I
what
don't remember
I
that.
used to give Living on the Fault Line to HR business partners to read because it was the first book I thought really about workforce segmentation.
Mm.
Even though he never mentions HR once, but he says, here's the 16 boxes of strategy, in terms of picking, and you can only compete in one area and one next to it. So I said, you need to read this because this talks about like how work is done and how you figure out what's critical work.
Yeah.
And I think the issue beyond it is you have to like reject that framework like, oh, it's bad to be a cost center because there's still things which are critical to do that and create success. And if organizations ever got to that whole point of like true mobile talent,
Yeah.
where you could move around, you could do a great job being a cost center, and then that would allow you to do a great job being a profit center. That's really the trick. But I think it's like you have to embrace what parts are value creating, which are cost savings, and then do both of those things around it. So I think it's like there still are critical elements to all of it.
Yeah. I mean, some people get really caught up on the whole concept of segmentation and critical roles and just the term criticality. And a lot of people misinterpret it as like whoever's paid the most, whoever's the most senior in the organization. But the reality is, and this I even sometimes would reterm it to say it's like these are roles that are strategy execution roles,
Yeah.
right? Because if you're a telecommunications company and you're laying fiber in the ground, guess who your most critical roles are? The people who are laying the fiber, if that's a strategic hindrance to your business, right?
Yeah.
It's not, the VP of operations or whoever. It's probably the people who are laying the fiber in the ground. And that kind of cuts through it. But if you come into, a senior leader meeting and you say, oh, these jobs are most critical, everybody is like, oh, so you're saying the C-suite roles aren't the most critical roles? And it's like, no, that's not what we're saying. And you just get into like these arguments that are, I feel like, somewhat pedantic. And so it's difficult to cut through some of that stuff. Do you have any kind of strategies about how you help organizations deploy these methodologies to kind of cut through some of the BS?
Yes. We have a lot of strategies, but around and a lot of suggestions, and I can't promise they're all heeded.
Sure.
But I think one of the true outputs of a really successful workforce planning is doing a fantastic job at identifying high value individual contributor roles, right? And I think that's like because we're going to have our leadership principles. And I think that's also like SWP versus org design, where org design is the framework of like, these are the executives and these are the problems in the heat map of their org that they need to focus on overall to be more successful, right? The things they have to worry about. And then workforce planning is like, when you look at that from perspective, these are the jobs, these are the skill gaps. If we want really effective individual contributors who lay that fiber or do whatever other build, which is really critical to us, are there gaps to that? And then the question now also is what parts, because some of the fiber is more not physical now, right? Sometimes the fiber you're laying is sort of more conceptual. Where can AI conceptually help lay some of that for some of these jobs as well? And then there's also, the talent shortages for a lot of these things too. Mm-hmm. So, so I think I think it's framing. I think it's just really good framing around like the purpose of the program and why you do it. And then the costs around doing it well versus good versus poorly.
Absolutely.
Around those things. Yeah.
Well, you want to join me in Cole's Corner?
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. Welcome to Cole's Corner. Well, let's start out with some rapid fire. So we established when we started out that you're an astrophysicist, or you studied astrophysics.
Exactly.
If you had decided to stay in astrophysics, what would you be doing right now in your career?
Well, the time I did it, most of the people were going out and going to work for like Lawrence Livermore and times like that. Mm-hmm. But I think I've been intrigued by all the use of AI in terms of, I don't know if you've ever read any of these articles about how astrophysicists use like observations and they inject fake signals into it in order to actually determine whether signals are real or not. So there's this vast field of using AI in astrophysics to actually interpret, like, is there life on this planet, potentially, or is there life supporting planet, like all this things like that. So I think that's like a fascinating sort of data intersection. So I think I would go with that. I would like still end up on this path where I'd be like trying like crazy AI stuff,
He's searching for alien life. I love it.
Searching for alien life.
No, I'm with that. So what's the place you've never been to that you most like to go and why?
I really want to go. There's a lot of places like that, but I want to go to I think they're called like the Lofgren Islands off of Norway, where you can hike, and like when you hike there during the solstice, everything is like green and orange and every imaginable color of that. I had a friend who went there and did that hike and sent me some pictures, and I'm like, that's high up on the list. Yeah.
That's awesome. I've never even heard of that. That's amazing. That's cool. Well, if you were a character in any book, TV show, or movie, who would you be and why?
Geez, what a tough question. You know what? Like since I've been recently watching Pluribus, I think I'd be her. You know what I mean? She's just.
Oh. So I've only seen clips of Pluribus on YouTube. I haven't actually seen the show. It does look fascinating. I don't have Apple TV. That's a good one. That's a deep cut. I like that.
So deeply cynical yet hopeful. Yeah. And so it's just like pushing to an extreme. So it's very current about it, but it's just, yeah.
I like that. Here's a fun fact for you. Do you know who invented the concept of the 5-year plan?
No, I don't know that.
Joseph Stalin.
Right. I didn't hear that before.
Right. I was like, what? And so that actually, I'll be honest with you, when I found that, it was not that long ago. I like re-evaluated my whole love for strategic workforce planning. I was like, do I want to love this if this is what it was meant for? but I don't know if you've gone through that journey at all.
Yeah, well, I did hear about there is someone who does a spiel about how the only people that really successfully do workforce planning is Stalinists, and then their
Yeah.
society failed as a result of doing it.
Mm-hmm.
So, um, but there's also the other theorem, which is that um, even the worst person is not 100% bad and could have a good idea.
Yeah. No, even a broken clock's right twice a day, so there you
Yeah,
go.
right. Exactly. There you go.
Well, I've got one big question for you.
Mhm.
So, if you were going to work with an organization and build the ideal workforce plan or planning function, what would that look like? And could you even lift it and shift it to other organizations?
I would, um, yeah, I think what it would look like up. So I think I've alluded to this already. It would look like up front with this, like getting sort of buy-in of like why we're doing it and
Mm-hmm.
how. And I would go big. This is how it's going to make us. This initiative is going to make us the leader in this field.
Mm.
I'd want to do it for somebody who was like a perennial number two or number three, who had a chance to look at and get that advantage, because that would be like fun, right? It wouldn't be like, it would also be cool, like to join a leader and kind of like build it out more. So I would want to get like these different inputs and define everybody's role in it. And then sort of like make sure that even if it wasn't gamified, that they viewed it as a game that they were participating in
Mm-hmm.
for these outputs. And I'd want to be like, I'd want to have like rewards for people like being right and for being wrong. Like being spectacularly wrong should have some things like that because it'd be like a learning thing. And I think I would do a lot of the stuff that is done today. I would like power it with data. Um, I would get the organization to abandon like 80% of its job taxonomy, but maybe keep some of the special stuff that's very specific to it and be like
Mm-hmm.
more market specific. Like I would give them a hybrid. Like the whole idea of the 80-20 rule, I'd be like, what 80% can we just throw away? You know what I mean? I would I would insist the organization would not have 14 to 17 or 12 layers. You know what I mean? It's so distributed.
Yeah.
I would convince the CEO that they can't have like 4 lines of reports to the next level and that sort of disinformation that could happen right there.
Yeah.
So I'd insist on being a really well functioning organization where those organizations meant something and they didn't change the names of them all the time and call that, redesign. Like if we just tweak this name, then we're really going to finally knock it out of the park. And then, and then it'll be a process which would run. I would say it should run quarterly as a process where you just go and you have a different sort of theme or flavor of like why you go through it and roll through it. That's like a little bit very high level.
No,
Is
I
that
love that. I especially love the cutting like 80% of roles, but I always call it like leaving the secret formula of Coca-Cola roles, right? Like what are the things that truly differentiate your company and make you unique that's a role that literally no other organization has. I love that. So that's fascinating.
Yeah. Well, here's a stat for you, which is interesting. In my first workforce planning project, the most critical role was all described by one name,
Mhm.
but the least one actually had 70 different permutations of the name internally. So that tells you something. When it's important, we know what to call it. You
Yeah.
know? Yeah.
Maybe, I bet you that would be something worth researching
Yeah.
internally across organizations. That if you see a proliferation of job titles, that means that your work is meaningless. That would be
Roll
a fun
slop.
research project to do.
Roll slop, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's funny.
Hey, this is William Tincup, and you should know about the You Should Know podcast. It's a topical, fun podcast with Ron, myself, and a guest, or guests, plural sometimes, and we tackle the most timely topics of the day. Give it a look, give it a listen, and subscribe. Thanks.
Well, let's do some what am I reading? So I'll start us with this first one, which is about John Maynard Keynes, probably the most famous economist in 1930, predicted that by the year 2030 that we would be doing about 15 hours of work every week. So not the standard 40-hour work week job. So this is from a LinkedIn post from Tim Ballard, who's showing some research about the number of hours that the typical worker works nowadays. And so, what they show in this research is that the 40-hour work week of 40 hours plus seems to be fading, and that more workers are working between 31 and 40 hours per week now than have in the past. Very few people are now working very long hours. So the number of people who worked 50 plus hours a week has halved since the year 2001. And then been a decline of also short hour roles. So people who are working less than 20 hours a week has also decreased over that period of time. So together, they're calling these trends the great compression of working hours. So fewer people are working the extremes of extremely long hours or extremely short hours, and things seem to be more concentrated in the middle between 20 to 40 hours a week. What did you think about this one, and was this surprising to you in any way?
It's not really surprising in terms of overall trend, although it did shake one of my, I've sometimes I've been guilty of saying the number one theorem of work is that work begets more work. So I think that's the great, shield against AI taking all the jobs, is that we're just really good. And
Filling up the day.
we are good. And there's a lot of very cultural elements of work too, right?
Yeah.
And things like that. So I'm not surprised though, like in my own organization, developers are much, uh, their schedules are much better based upon using Copilot, right? And things like that. And people are able to use a lot more tools they couldn't use before. So we all have like a world book at our fingers now, right? Or something like that. So I'm not totally surprised. I was really surprised by the compression of the short work weeks
Yeah.
around that. I don't know what to make of it. Although I think it might be also that these are like the opportunities of things that that people are farming out and they weren't keeping track of, and they're like, hey, I'm not that worried about. So I think there might be actually a decline in the population in general who have some of these short hour weeks. I don't know. What are your thoughts on it?
I think there's like two things going on. I think one is there's like this humanist belief that as society gets more productive, we're all just going to sit around and eat grapes and work like 7 hours a week. And realistically, there's two reasons why that won't happen. One, in the United States, I believe it's if you don't work 32 hours a week, you're not considered a full time employee, and therefore you don't get benefits. And since we
Right.
don't have like universal health care, I think you'd probably see a staggering number of people who are at 32 hours a week or 33 hours a week just to meet that threshold, probably. But the second reason is just because companies are competitive, right? And so if one company starts to pull ahead, guess what? The natural inclination of the CEO of the other company is to say, we need to work harder or we're falling behind. And so, you see this kind of ratcheting up of yeah, well, maybe we did become more productive over the last year, but because of that, our competition is forced to become more productive. And therefore you see this kind of like meta effect at a societal level that even though everyone's becoming more productive, they all are normalizing that productivity, and therefore everyone has to stay working longer hours. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
I think that's true. There's sort of the mutually assured, whatever,
Yeah.
you know, there's like the quote death spiral of capitalism, mutually assured, whatever. It's like it
Yeah.
keeps on driving us to do more. And that's been behind return to office too, right?
Yeah.
Where it's not fact based. Like certainly there are, and there's been a natural drift back. There's a lot of research which says,
Sure.
hey, if you're a newer in workforce, you're lost, right? So there's a natural drift back. And so there's some sort of blend of it. So I think that's part of that whole part where it's like there is like a keeping the foot on the pedal element of it. And I think it also it kind of ties into a lot of our conversation today about this non-planful organizations,
Mm-hmm.
right? Where it's like, hey, there is a number which is correct of where you're actually doing that work output, and people are just like using their beliefs instead of how work should look. They're using
Yeah.
presence versus output is their measure, right? So
Yeah. All right. Well, let me hit you with the next one. I saw this article and I was like, Peter's going to love this. And so, recent post by Damiano D'Urso, I think is how you pronounce it, about bees and strategic workforce planning, how swarm intelligence can guide people decisions. And it's actually a surprisingly technical article that I'm not going to go too much into the details of, but they introduced this concept of what is it? It's HTCA, so hiring, training, concentrating, and automating as kind of a model for thinking about workforce planning. And they introduced the bee swarm optimization, I guess something that they probably took from like biology as a methodology for how to adapt that to workforce planning. And so they use these three concepts of bees. So there's scout bees that test bold structural pivots. There's onlooker bees that make finely tuned tweaks to they're all going out and exploring for pollen. And then elite bees who preserve the best performing plans thus far. And they take this methodology and mimic it to HR and strategy to show that there's folks that are pushing different radical scenarios. These would be the scouts that are going out there kind of testing the limits of where you might go as an organization. There's the testing of incremental adjustments. So these would be the onlooker bees. And then there's the don't lose strong existing plans, which would be the elite bees. And these different compositions of how you would go in and represent the HTCA, I believe is what it is, in your organization. But I'm probably doing a poor job of explaining this because it's actually quite dense, but I thought it was fascinating. What did you think about this one, Peter? And are you guys introducing bee swarm optimization into the Vemo product as a consequence?
We started doing it as soon as I got this article from you.
That's awesome. I love it.
I think there's an element that we have, which I think a lot of times, and I think we did much more plain speak. We have the version, which is like, we call silly executive questions, where we feel like people, every time they do a scenario, they have 9 questions that you would never do for every 10th you might iterate. And this is true both in workforce planning and org design. So the idea is like, can you automate that process around rapidly seeing how these scenarios look like and doing those, doing the ones like the radical explorations? Can you do all those radical explorations that you're not going to do? The part about the article that was like, that it's a little bit one size fits all. So I kind of would go back to like what your strategy is around it, where it's like, are you trying to you have to do some radical things. Like think about like all these AI companies who have just created fabulous wealth, right? They weren't, no one was keeping the plan, right? There was no plan. I know there's times of growth, but there are companies who are like, maybe that's like the whole part of keeping the plan is like that whole resistance to change, right? So it's like, it kind of goes back to that original concept of like, you have to know when to cannibalize what makes you most successful. And you have to do it like really artfully if you want to continually reinvent yourself. So these keepers of the plan, these guardians sometimes actually have to shift, right? So it made me think, then right after you gave me this to look at, I read an article in the Times on lizards. And these lizards, they've been studying, some are orange spotted, some are yellow spotted, some are blue spotted. So they went deep into DNA. It was really hard to collect. And they realized that the yellow and the blue had no DNA difference. They're identical. And it was environmental what made them yellow and blue. And it was like they call it like the rock. You should check it out. It's like the rock, paper, scissors lizards.
Wow.
And what it basically was is like environmental. So I was thinking about this and the bees and the other biological metaphors, and thinking about like the whole adaptation. You need like an adaptation. Like these bees are going to have to like, they're going to have to change from blue spotted lizards to yellow spotted lizards sometimes as well.
Yeah, you need to add some stochastic mechanisms into the bee optimization model.
Stochastic mechanisms, yes.
Yeah, that's fascinating. All right, well, let me hit you with the last one. Frequent person we've cited on the podcast, Dr. John Sullivan, always writing something provocative. Right. And so he recently published an article called Pay to Apply and Other Ways to Discourage Spam Job Applications from AI Agents. And the synopsis of it is, they've seen record numbers of applications, up to 45% now coming from AI agents, so not real human beings necessarily. And 20% of employers are considering that people will actually need to pay to apply to jobs. And it won't be large sums of money, but it's a decent amount. And they say for about $13 per week, an automated robot will send out 50 resumes for a candidate each and every day. And this is becoming increasingly popular. And so this is really creating somewhat of a crisis for traditional, job boards and open applications. And what Dr. John Sullivan recommends is that there's really three things that you could do about it. If you wanted to reduce the number of applications and make it more likely for human beings to apply, it's one, you can have pay to apply, which we've already talked about. You could limit the number of applications that any one human being could make per month. You could emphasize employee referrals. You could bypass the quick apply feature that's on most major job boards and adding a I am a not a robot verification process, even though I think AI agents have beaten that, but you could still add that in as a way of doing this. But really what you're trying to increase is whether or not an applicant is fully qualified, whether they're a good fit for the role, and whether the candidate is interested in the company rather than this kind of spray and pray approach that's going on with online job applications. But have you seen this effect? And what were your thoughts on this one, Peter?
Well, yeah, I was interested because he's famous for saying I'm the provocateur, right?
Yeah, he is.
And so he brings it to its natural limit. But then I was thinking about, I think there are some of us in the market who kind of like secretly kind of enjoyed when candidates had a little bit of their revenge on, because we heard a lot a couple of years ago about like, hey, these companies are like creating this, this sort of quote semi-AI fortress of, that prevents us even from getting qualified applicants in.
Sure.
And there's this fundamental problem always of this is like one of the oldest recruiting things, right? Which is like candidate looks great, we'll do great. Candidate looks great, we'll do poorly. Candidate looks bad, we'll do great. So there's always that 4-box model.
Yeah. The type 1 and type 2 error, essentially.
Yeah. And so I think it's like the whole issue to me, like this one, almost the most back to like the non-planful organization, right? Like you create this problem because you don't plan, you create a requisition that may or may not be filled. Like we have these stats in workforce planning, like less than 50% of requisitions are ever filled that are created because there's some process and there's some silo where people are allowed to like, oh, I have to fill this. And then it kind of gets to the point where it's like, oh, we can't afford it after all. We didn't plan, blah, blah, blah. So it may or may not be filled. It may not be stated correctly what the job even is. And you don't actually have a plan of like, what's the talent we need? And if you had the plan what the talent you need, you could then see what can we fill internally. And then you could actually build those pipelines and have like more of like a fair system for bringing people in. So I think it speaks to like, I know it's sort of like the symptom, right, of this sort of like unfair system we've designed. And so that's why I like to say, even though like I've been accused a lot of times of being like, hey, you're in workforce planning, you're part of the Bob and Bob community. But in essence, it's like
Bob and Bob community. I'm what does that mean?
Office space,
Oh, okay. Yeah.
But it's like
Bob's.
Yeah. So, but essentially, workforce planning could allow you to become a more fair organization. Yeah. It could actually, it could be great for your employer brand in that way. So I don't profess to actually know the solution to this. I assume that people will just build better screeners. It'll be like the back and forth around this, but really there's a way out. There's a path out.
One of these, talent acquisition platform companies is going to build some kind of screen, whether it's not the I am not a robot, but something that, just like they do to prevent web scraping, they'll build some kind of thing that doesn't allow mass applications at some point, I suspect. But until then, this is the irony of it. I thought this was the logic was a little bit flimsy. If somebody's willing to pay $13 a week to use an AI bot and we want to charge a few cents per application, I suspect it's probably going to add up to about $13 a week to apply to all those jobs. If they're willing to pay for the AI bot, why would they not be willing to pay to apply to jobs? And, companies are going to start using this as like a way of charging people to apply. There's something oddly perverse about that, in my opinion. And so like it just seems like a bad model all the way around. And ultimately creates a bunch of unfairness issues that I think we could all see. But like this just seems silly.
I think there could be a little gag on it. It's like head of HR asking the head of recruiting, like, so how much money we made on applicants?
Yeah,
This
it creates a perverse incentive.
It's trending down. You better get some more job adverts out.
Yeah, it goes from 1 cent to 5 cents to $1 to $5 to apply to a job, and all of a sudden, you're now just making money off people applying to jobs.
You're like, I thought that was what college was for. Darn it.
Well, and there's some kind of equilibrium where if you make the fee to apply to the job high enough, no one will apply to it. And then in the limit, what does that look like? And so I don't know. It's a fascinating thought experiment, but I think it's bad in practice, frankly. But
yeah, but it's a good one. These fascinating experiments are the way to plumb the extremes, right?
Absolutely. Well, I think you had something you wanted to talk to me about in terms of like, what's going on with workforce transformation. Did you want to talk about that before we wrapped up?
Yeah, I just had a sort of question for you that I've been asking about, and not everyone's been appreciating when I ask this question, because I was thinking about transformation. It's almost like it's like a time of great duress and radical evolution, right? So everyone's talking a lot about workforce transformation.
Yeah.
And it's a time of extreme change. And then I've observed from my peer vendor group, or whatever that might mean exactly, that everybody's like trying to become like theory of everything, right?
Yeah.
Oh, we're going to do your tasks and your workforce planning and your skills. And, it's a whole part, like, and there's all this convergence, which is happening at the same time. But in transformation, specialization is what wins usually, right? And, if you take we had the biology example, right? Bees, lizards, now whatever this is. So how do you is it possible? Are people making the wrong idea right now that it's convergence is great, like when things are sort of stable and you kind of like assembling everything, but like what kind of market are we really in?
Well, I think you've identified it. This is the way I've been putting it, because I saw 2 different research studies a few weeks ago. I saw them like back to back with one another. One was from the CHRO Association. It showed like something like 80% of CHROs were looking for case studies about how to do workforce transformation from other companies. So essentially they could take what that other company did and copy it and apply it to their organization. And then I saw a second piece of research from Heidrick and Struggles that said, the top thing that CEOs are looking for in a new CHRO is first principles thinking and kind of the willingness to, be unique and special and not copy other people. And I was like, that's the crux of the issue. CHROs are looking to copy everybody else. CEOs don't want them to copy everybody else, and they want them to be specialized and focus on what's kind of the unique value proposition and the workforce associated with that for their organization. And fundamentally, HR is at that nexus point. And so HR just wants to be sheeple, and CEOs want them to be kind of unique. And I think that's really what you're seeing here.
Yeah. It kind of speaks to, but it's kind of a mistake to pin it solely on HR, because there's that AI risk of becoming an AI receptacle, right?
Sure.
Where stop inventing new stuff.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And I think that's humans will always invent new stuff. So maybe it's,
well, if you can't tell from my answer, I'm more biased towards the niches, specialization, first principles thinking. And I've been trying to inject that into every organization I've worked at in my career, much to the chagrin of my leadership, who would much rather, be standardized, copy whatever Google did 15 years ago. And it just gets kind of silly at a certain point. So I don't know. Is that what you were hoping to react to with there?
Yeah, I was really hoping. I'm really interested in this question about what the right path is, because if you go to specialization right now, you are a salmon swimming upstream.
Yeah.
And the question, but that might be the path, right? And so
just to use the example of like AI in particular, AI seems to be coming for all standardized work as long as it's digital. And so it seems like specialized and niche type work is the future, or things that are non-digital in nature. If you have a 2x2 chart, again, you have like digital, non-digital, specialized versus standardized. The box you want to be in is the non-digital specialized box, because that's probably the least likely to be disrupted. but I think it's still fine to be in the digital specialized box, probably for the time being.
Yeah, I think that's a good point.
Yeah.
It's a really great analogy. It's a lot to think about.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, Peter, this has been a fantastic conversation. Where can people reach out to you or to Vemo if they're interested in learning more about your organization or bringing you in to help out with what they're doing?
Yeah, so they can, they can hit our website at vemo-workforce.com. They can look us up on LinkedIn at Vemo Workforce. They can connect with me, Peter Louch, there. And one thing I would encourage people to do is hit us up on our LinkedIn page, and then sign up for our newsletter. We try to issue a really good newsletter where we really we're not selling. We're really talking about how do you build a business case. We're going to launch a new series next year called Now What? And it kind of is based upon what I was talking about, how a lot of people told me the board of directors says we need to become a skills-based organization.
Yeah.
They tell me, or we need to be workforce planning, but then we forget to ask them, what do you mean by that? Right?
Yeah.
So I want to give people a now what. I want to tell people hey, these are 3 different ways we could make this reality. Which one is what you have in mind? We want to give people those upfront challenge questions to frame these efforts. So that's so I hope people hit us up for that and join that newsletter and stay in our orb in that way, and so we can continue to influence this area.
No, I love that. I love that you guys are kind of giving back that knowledge to the community as well from what you've learned on top of all the organizations that you've worked with over the years. But this has been a fantastic episode. Thanks so much for joining, Peter. You've been listening to Directionally Correct, a People Analytics podcast with your host, Cole Napper. Today's guest, Peter Louch, the CEO of Vemo, as a part of our HR Tech Voices series. Thanks so much, Peter.
Thanks, Cole. Great to see you.